r/NoSleep. It knocks 3 times every night at midnight. Every night, as the clock strikes midnight, there's a knocking on our front door. It's not a loud knock, not enough to wake the neighbors, but enough to jolt anyone who's sitting close by. And it always comes in sets of 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. My family has lived in this house for nearly 2 decades, and every night, it's the same sound. When I was younger, I thought everyone had something strange in their home, a noise, a smell, a shadow that lingered a bit too long. It wasn't until I stayed over at friends' houses that I realized other families didn't have midnight knocks. My parents never explained it, but as I got older, I began to notice small things, the way my mom would sit up, clutching the edge of her chair, or how my dad would tense his jaw every night, waiting for it to pass. No one ever tried to open the door to see who, or what, was knocking. I always thought it was because they were too afraid. But one night, I asked my dad, "Why don't we ever open the door when it knocks?" He looked at me, a strange, sad smile on his face. "Because, son, we already know what's out there. And once you've seen it, you don't forget." I was 16 at the time, and it was the first time I'd seen fear in my dad's eyes. He was a tall, burly man, the kind who could silence a whole room with a single look. But when it came to that midnight knock, his usual bravery melted into quiet dread. I wanted to ask more, to press him for answers, but something told me to leave it alone. As the years went by, I became used to the knock. It was part of our lives, like a broken light switch you learn to ignore. But then, one winter night, something changed. I'd just come back from college for Christmas break, and my younger sister, Sarah, had invited a friend over for a sleepover. Sarah's friend, Maggie, was a curious girl, always poking her nose where it didn't belong. When midnight rolled around and the knocks began, Maggie's face lit up with excitement. "Who's that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and fear. Sarah tried to wave her off, but Maggie wouldn't let it go. "Don't you want to know who's knocking?" she asked, already inching toward the door. "No, Maggie," Sarah hissed. "We don't open the door." "But what if it's just a prank?" Maggie argued, her hand reaching out to the door handle. Before any of us could stop her, she had turned the handle and yanked the door open. The silence that followed was thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Nothing. The porch was empty, just the cold night air blowing in from the trees at the edge of the yard. Maggie laughed nervously, stepping outside and looking around. "See? There's no one here," she called back. But just as she was about to step back inside, we all heard it, a soft, shuffling sound from the bushes at the edge of the yard. Maggie froze, her face paling. She turned slowly, staring at the shadows that clung to the trees. "Come inside, Maggie," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. But Maggie didn't move. Her eyes were locked on something in the dark, something that was moving closer. My dad grabbed her arm and yanked her back inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. "Never open the door at midnight," he whispered, his voice thick with anger and fear. For the rest of the night, the knocking didn't stop. It was relentless, pounding on every door and window in the house. My dad stayed up all night, pacing, muttering to himself, his eyes darting to every shadow. The next morning, the knocking finally stopped, but things were different. Maggie left, pale and shaken, and we didn't hear from her for weeks. Sarah was quiet, withdrawn, her usual laughter and lightness replaced by a somber silence. Months passed, and life settled back into its strange routine. But one night, just before summer, something new happened. This time, instead of knocking, we heard scratching, light, almost hesitant, as if something was testing the door. My dad was the first to react, pulling us all into the living room and locking every door and window. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent, moving from door to door, window to window, as if searching for a way inside. Then, a voice, a low, raspy whisper that seemed to seep through the walls. "Let me in," it murmured, so quiet we could barely hear it. "Just let me in." We stayed huddled together in the living room, each of us clutching each other, hearts pounding as the whisper grew louder, filling the room, echoing in our ears. Finally, my dad stood up, his face pale but determined. He walked to the front door and spoke in a voice I'd never heard him use before, a voice filled with quiet, desperate pleading. "You don't belong here," he said. "Leave us alone." There was a long pause, and then, slowly, the whisper faded. The scratching stopped, and the house fell silent once more. That was the last time we heard anything at midnight. For weeks, I held my breath, waiting for the knocks to return, But they never did. The house was quiet, almost peaceful. Then, one morning, a letter arrived in the mail. There was no return address, just a single line scrawled on a torn piece of paper. You can only run for so long. The knocks never returned, but some nights, when the wind is quiet and the stars are hidden behind clouds, I hear something in the distance, a faint, familiar knocking, as if whatever was out there is still searching for a way inside. We don't talk about it, don't mention it to neighbors or friends. My dad says we're safe as long as we don't look back, as long as we don't let it in. But some nights, I wonder if it's still out there, wandering from house to house, knocking, waiting, searching for the one door that might finally let it in. But some nights, I wonder if it's still out there, wandering from house to house, knocking, waiting, searching for the one door that might finally let it in. The memory of that winter's night haunted us in strange ways. For weeks, Sarah slept with her light on, her closet door locked, and her bed pushed against her bedroom door. My dad checked the locks on the front door obsessively, not once, not twice, but 3 times each night before bed, mirroring the rhythm of those dreaded knocks. I returned to college with a newfound appreciation for every normal night that passed in silence. Yet, the fear had planted its roots deep inside me. I'd find myself glancing at my dorm room door each night, waiting, listening, half expecting that same ominous rhythm of knocks. It didn't come. Not there, at least. But at home, it wasn't over. One night, during a phone call with Sarah, she mentioned something strange. "Jake," she whispered, her voice so low I could barely hear her. "I don't think it ever really left." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a chill creep up my spine. "It's different now. No knocks. But I hear whispers sometimes. Late at night, when I'm half asleep, I hear it saying things. I can't make out all of it, but it knows our names, Jake. It knows everything." I stayed silent, listening to the shaky breaths on the other end of the line. "There's more," she continued, her voice quivering. "Last night, I woke up and the door to my room was open. I'm sure I locked it, but when I woke up, it was open. Just a crack. Like something had been watching." I couldn't sleep after that call. I thought about my family, alone in that house, living with whatever had attached itself to them, to us. Guilt gnawed at me, and I found myself counting down the days until the next holiday break, when I could go home again. When spring break finally came, I drove straight home, clutching the wheel as I approached the familiar, lonely house standing at the edge of the woods. The house looked unchanged from the outside, quiet, empty, as if waiting. But the moment I walked in, the atmosphere felt heavier, as though something unseen pressed down on the walls, seeped into the air. My parents greeted me with forced smiles, but I could see the weariness etched into their faces, the haunted look that lingered in their eyes. The first night back, I stayed up, unable to sleep. I sat in the living room, staring at the door, waiting. Midnight came and went in silence, but there was a restlessness in the air, an electric tension that made my skin crawl. I stayed up late, listening to the silence, until exhaustion finally pulled me into a restless sleep. But the following night, things changed. It started with a chill. The kind of cold that settles into your bones, no matter how many blankets you pile on. I woke up, shivering, and looked around, realizing the bedroom door was slightly ajar. Had I forgotten to close it? I reached out to shut it but stopped. A soft scratching sound, barely a whisper, drifted down the hallway. I held my breath, heart pounding, as the scratching grew louder, then faded, then grew louder again, as though it was moving closer, inching its way toward my room. I lay frozen, too terrified to move, feeling every muscle tense as I strained to listen. Then, the scratching stopped, replaced by a low, raspy whisper. "Jake." My heart skipped a beat. It was calling my name. I didn't answer, didn't move, barely dared to breathe. But the whisper continued, soft, insistent, like it knew I was listening. "Jake. Open the door." I shut my eyes tight, willing it to go away. But the voice grew louder, more urgent. It was so close now, as though it was right outside my door, waiting. My mind raced, remembering my dad's words, "Never open the door." The whisper continued for what felt like hours, slowly fading until there was silence. Finally, I drifted off, but even in my dreams, I could feel its presence. The next morning, I found Sarah in the kitchen, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. She looked at me, and I saw a mix of fear and relief. "You heard it too, didn't you?" she whispered. I nodded, a knot forming in my stomach. My dad entered the kitchen, his face haggard, and set a small, dusty box on the table. I'd never seen it before. "Your grandfather left this for me," he said, his voice low. "And now, it's time I pass it to you." Inside the box was an old journal, its pages yellowed and fragile. My dad motioned for me to open it, and I began to read. The entries were dated decades ago, written in my grandfather's shaky handwriting. They told of a similar haunting, a presence that visited his family every night, knocking, whispering, always asking to be let in. He described the terror, the sleepless nights, the fear that something was watching, waiting. Then, I reached the last entry. It was short, hastily scrawled, the words barely legible. "It won't leave. It wants something, something it lost, something it can't find. And it won't stop until it's found." I looked up at my dad, my heart pounding. What did it lose? What does it want? He shook his head. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's been searching for years, moving from family to family. It found us, and now, it's looking for a way in." Over the next few days, the haunting escalated. Doors creaked open on their own, objects moved, and the air in the house grew colder, as if something was draining the warmth from the walls. Every night, I heard my name whispered in the darkness, and every night, I lay frozen, unable to move. Then, one night, the whispers changed. They grew louder, angrier, demanding. They called all our names, echoing through the house, filling every corner. "Let me in. Let me in." The walls seemed to shake, the lights flickering as the voice grew louder, more desperate. My dad gathered us in the living room, his face set in grim determination. "It's time to end this," he said, clutching the old journal. He opened it to the last page, where there was a drawing, a strange symbol with instructions scribbled in the margins. "It's a ward," he explained, his voice trembling. "Our only chance to banish it." We spent the next hour following the instructions, marking the symbol on every door and window, every possible entry point. As we worked, the voice grew louder, more frantic, pounding on every door, every window, shaking the walls. But as we completed the final mark, a sudden silence fell over the house. We waited, huddled together, every breath echoing in the quiet. And then, the door to the house rattled, as if something was testing it, pressing against it. But it couldn't get in. The wards held, and slowly, the pressure lifted. For the first time in years, the house felt empty. Whatever it was, it had finally given up. Or so we thought. The peace lasted for months. We moved on, tried to forget the horror that had haunted us for so long. But then, one day, a letter arrived. It was postmarked from another state, addressed to my dad, and inside was a single line scrawled on a piece of paper. "I'll find my way in eventually,